Like the video and subscribe to our channel right now and get 1 week of amazing luck. The globe has tragically witnessed more animal extinctions than you can count, whether they were caused by human involvement, climate change, or another type of natural disaster. But have you ever questioned whether they could be brought back? If so, you are not alone. Today, we're counting down some of the most bizarre animals that researchers are working to resurrect. So get ready, because this is the top 10 extinct animals scientists brought back. Number 10. Caspian tigers. Turkey and much of Central Asia, including Iran, Iraq, and northwestern China, were home to Caspian tigers during their prime. But with the Russian colonization of Turkestan in the late 19th century, their numbers started to be threatened. The tigers were definitely being pursued by huge groups of sportsmen or military personnel, which was the first issue. The army was used to eradicate predators from the forests surrounding settlements and prospective agricultural regions up until the early 20th century. In fact, up to World War I, the forests saw the yearly deaths of roughly 50 tigers. Even though they were an officially protected species by the 1950s, the last Caspian tigers vanished by the 1970s. However, because the Siberian tiger is the Caspian tiger's closest relative, discussions about relocating the Siberian tiger to a safe area in Central Asia have begun. If this is done correctly, the tiger should adapt and live successfully where the Caspian tiger once roamed. Number 9. ORYX. Regarded as the wild ancestor of our domestic cattle. When I say enormous, I mean large. According to some sources, ORYX could grow as tall as 6.6 feet at the shoulder and weigh as much as 3,000 pounds. They were a kind of gigantic cattle that once roamed Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The ORYX went extinct in 1627, however, as a result of poaching and the loss of their habitat. Scientists believe that it may not be impossible to recreate the extinct species, nonetheless. Heinz Heck, a German biologist, started a selective breeding program in the 1920s with the aim of reintroducing the ORYX through the use of various cattle types. Essentially, the goal was to breed out the purposes for which they had been domesticated. The outcome was known as offal cattle. After being released into the Netherlands in the 1980s, these herds of hellish cattle have subsequently been crossed with other European cattle breeds in an effort to produce a cow that is more resemblant to an ORYX. Number 8. CUBAN macaw. Prior to the 15th century, these vivacious and colorful birds were common throughout Cuba's main island. However, when the first European settlers arrived, they had different ideas for these parrots. Even if native communities had hunted the species before the invasion of the colonists, after their arrival, the abundance increased. Due to extensive overhunting and habitat devastation in the late 19th century, the last of the Cuban macaws died, declaring the species extinct. Many were slaughtered, exchanged, or shipped back to Europe to live as cage birds. However, the British author Errol Fuller claims that a cultivator is thought to have created birds with a resemblance to the Cuban macaw using genes from a sibling species. So who knows, we might soon witness them flying over Cuba. Number 7. Quagga. The quagga, once a common subspecies of zebra found throughout South Africa, was tragically hunted to extinction in the 19th century. After European settlers arrived in South Africa and began hunting the species nearly to extinction because it competed with domesticated animals for food, the population began to drop. The wild population had been wiped out by 1878, though some animals were transferred to zoos in Europe in an effort to save them. Tragically, breeding programs failed, and the last captive quagga passed away in Amsterdam in 1883. That is until the quagga became the first extinct species to have its DNA analyzed around a century later, at which point researchers realized how similar the quagga's DNA was to that of the plain zebra. In 1987, the Quagga project got underway, with the goal of selecting and breeding the genetically closest subspecies, now known to be the zebra, in order to duplicate the phenotypic of hair coat pattern. Since its inception in 1988, the first foal of this initiative has had considerable success. The selectively bred zebras will be returned to the wild if all goes according to plan. Number 6. Arabian oryx. In the past, you could have seen Arabian oryx roaming around most of the Middle East, but by the late 19th century, you were unlikely to see one outside of Saudi Arabia, and by the 1930s, the only remaining populations could be found in either the Nifa Desert in the north or the Ruba Kali Desert in the south. Tragically, things continued to become worse. Arabian princes and oil firms began hunting the animal regularly starting in the 1930s, and eventually, the hunts expanded to use up to 300 vehicles at once. The northern population was practically gone by the middle of the 20th century, and the last Arabian oryx passed away in 1972. Fortunately, some people sent a pair into captivity, and a few years later, they were successfully released back into the wild. They are still an endangered species, despite the fact that they are the first animal to return to their vulnerable status after being declared extinct. Therefore, the situation is improving. Number 5. The Tasmanian tiger. The Tasmanian tiger was originally a carnivorous marsupial that was indigenous to the Australian mainland as well as the islands of Tasmania and New Guinea, but starting in the 19th century, overhunting became the main cause of its extinction. Sadly, Elias Churchill illegally captured the last Tasmanian tiger in 1936, selling her to a zoo where she lived out her final years. The Australian Museum started a cloning experiment for the animal in 1999. It was initially thought to be a publicity hoax, but in 2002, scientists were able to successfully extract replicable DNA from the specimens, and the Tasmanian tiger may return within our lifetimes. The University of Melbourne stated in August of last year that it will collaborate with a firm called Colossal Biosciences to try to replicate the species using its closest living kin and then return it to Tasmania. Number 4. The dodo. The dodo was maybe the most recognizable extinct animal because to how completely bonkers this bird looked. The dodo was formerly only found on the island of Mauritius, but what made it so remarkable was that it evolved without any real predators. The dodo, however, was completely fearless of people, just like many other animals that evolved in isolation. Unfortunately, this lack of fear and the dodo's inability to fly made it an all-too-simple target for sailors. Contrary to common myth, however, it wasn't just hunting that wiped off the dodos. The introduction of other creatures into their environment, such as pigs and monkeys, drove them to abandon their nests and petition businesses for scarce food. Since these cartoon-like birds went extinct in the 17th century, it is technically impossible to bring them back, but scientists are making an effort. Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Beth Shapiro of the University of California claimed to have finished thoroughly sequencing the genome of the dodo was derived from an ancient DNA using genetic material taken from dodo remains. Number 3. The Pyrenean IBEX. If we're talking about a genuine extinct animal that has been successfully brought back to life, the Pyrenean IBEX is in a league of its own. While there are numerous genetic tests in the works along with the breeding of like-extinct species in the hopes of adaptation, the Pyrenean IBEX was officially declared extinct in 2000, despite once being common in places like France, Portugal, Spain, and Andorra. Starting in the late 19th century, however, their population started to decline. But unlike any of the others on our list, this animal's amazing feature is that 3 years after the last one passed away, scientists utilized its frozen cells to clone a calf, making it the first and only species to have a living specimen remain after extinction. Sadly, the clone did not live for very long after birth. In fact, it passed away a few minutes later owing to a lung abnormality, but it did demonstrate that it would be feasible to bring a species back from the grave. Number 2. Woolly mammoths. The enormous fuzzy ancestor of the elephant, the woolly mammoth, is perhaps one of the most famous extinct species ever recorded. I'm sure we're all familiar with it. Woolly mammoths were last seen in isolation on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean some 4,000 years ago, and the first known behemoth bones were notably discovered in Siberia in the late 18th century. It's noteworthy to note that initially, the researchers who were researching them were very perplexed since they could not comprehend how a warm-blooded animal like an elephant could have ended up in such a very cold environment. But after putting everything together, they understood that what they had discovered was the carcass of an extinct animal. Amazingly, since those early years of skepticism, the carcasses of the extinct creature have been exceptionally well preserved by ice thanks to the extreme temperatures in the Arctic, enabling researchers to access the DNA in ways that are not always possible. And as a result, there are reportedly plans to try to bring the animals back into existence. In fact, after the Mammoths Genome Project was completed in 2015, it was suggested that the species may be revived through a variety of techniques. Therefore, even though it hasn't happened yet, it appears that it will soon. Number 1. Heath hens. Once an extremely widespread bird in colonial times, the prairie chicken subspecies known as heath hens was widespread across North America. However, colonizers who hunted them extensively for food had a significant impact on the population, just as they did with many other animals. In fact, it has been hypothesized that heathens rather than wild turkeys were eaten during the first Thanksgiving. However, by the 18th century, because of their low cost and abundance, heath hens had earned a reputation as the poor man's food. And as the hunting continued to soar, the heath hens became more and more of a distant memory. Only a few hundred animals survived on the mainland by the 1870s, and there were only a few hundred on Martha's Vineyard. The late 19th century saw the implementation of a hunting prohibition in an effort to preserve the remaining 70 animals. This was successful for a while, but a number of issues led to the death of the last heath hen in 1932. However, there is still hope for them to come back because they are closely related to the prairie chicken. Researchers have begun working on programs to bring the animal back from the brink of extinction by using DNA from preserved cells as a foundation for reconstructing the greater prairie bird's DNA. So hopefully heathens will start to wander about again shortly.